Good evening. This is my first live video chat, and we're going to be talking about the intelligence community, foreign and domestic, in the lead up to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Um, in order to move forward, to go backwards in time, in order to give a more clear explanation as to how the attacks happened and why it happened in the way it did. So one area I like to start with is 1979, because this is when the Soviet Union in the country of Afghanistan, and most of the major players, or at least some of the more influential players involving in the September 11th attacks, are arisen from here at this period. And so when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan, it was basically publicly condemned by the Afghan community and the Arab world altogether. And the United States considered the Soviet Union as a direct threat. Former White House National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor under the Carter administration, wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, which was basically an outline of how the United States needed to be the sole global superpower, as opposed to having the Soviet Union as a competitor or the sole superpower in itself. And so the outline was simple, in that the United States needed to control Eurasia, a combination of Southeast Asia and, of course, the Middle East, in regards to keeping the oil reserves away from the competing superpower Soviet Union. And so what the United States did, with the help of the Gulf and Pakistan, was to fund the Mujahideen, who were in the process of fighting against the Soviets at this time. The CIA called the operation Operation Cyclone, which was the largest CIA operation in its history, and up to the present day, it's the largest operation in the agency's history. And he spent well over $300 million on the operation. And what caused the tide of the war was the Reagan administration, which preceded the Carter administration, with the help of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Pakistan ISI, which is the Pakistan's intelligence service there, was that they were going to allow the sales of Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen to shoot down helicopters and planes. And when they did that, that turned the tide of the war, because the Soviet Union was actually having the upper hand by bombarding the mountainous region in southern Afghanistan, which is where most of the Mujahideen were fighting, and also where another faction, an Islamic faction that arisen out of the madrasas in Jalalabad and Islamabad, were from, and it's the Taliban, headed by Mohammed Mullah Omar. When the Afghan nationals were being killed by the hundreds and even in the thousands, it was the Taliban that were replacing them, these religious fanatics that were replacing them in the battlefield. Now, when it comes to the Arabs, foreign Arabs coming from Saudi Arabia, Libya, Syria, even the United States, they weren't really accepted by the Afghan community. Nevertheless, they did partake in the battle, and it was maybe about 10% of the fighting force to begin with. In 1989, the Soviet Union brokered a peace deal with Pakistan acting as a mediator under Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, for the Soviet Union to retreat out of the country. They were, at this point, a broken country. The military was defeated, and the Afghans basically won in the duration. There's actually a quote by the Afghans in which they say, Soviet Union may have the watches, but we have the time. And so what they did was wait it out to the as long as they could. and the Soviets basically couldn't anymore, so they retreated in 1989. However, there was still some communist influences within the government of Afghanistan, so the Taliban were fighting for control of the country, especially to its south. There was a Afghan faction called the Northern Alliance, which was a splinter group from older Afghan groups that weren't as ultra-Orthodox as, say, the Taliban. Now, there was a couple of Afghan groups headed by other Afghan leaders, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who headed the group Hizb Islami, and Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. But Sayyaf was actually an associate of Massoud and a friend, but he didn't involve himself into the next step, which was the civil war between the Northern Alliance and the Taliban. The CIA in the United States at this point basically retreated. They saw that the Soviet Union had lost, and they had no concern about rebuilding the country. Now, this caused some uproar within the Muslim community, especially to the Afghans, who basically saw what the NGOs or the non-government organizations were trying to help with the Afghan war. But it was the Taliban who kicked out all the NGOs that didn't want their help anymore because they didn't want Western influence in the country, because they wanted Afghan to become a country ruled by the Quran and the Sunnah, making it into a small version of the caliphate. And the Northern Alliance was not ultra-Orthodox. They were led by a Pashtun, I'm sorry, not a Pashtun, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who had a resilient faction that was fighting the Taliban at this point. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who headed one of the largest groups, Hizb al-Islami, didn't like Massoud and basically brokered a deal with the Taliban to basically help them fight against the Massoud faction, the Northern Alliance. This civil war, and in fact it wasn't one civil war, it was actually two civil wars that really caused more death and destruction than the 10-year war with the Soviet Union invading the country of Afghanistan. The United States basically was witnessing this from behind. Meanwhile, the Pakistan ISI was supporting the Taliban covertly, and as well as the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate, which is the intelligence services of Saudi Arabia, and very influential religious Saudis who were donating to the Taliban at the same time. So the Taliban was basically getting millions of dollars in funding and training from the Pakistan ISI, from the Saudi GID, and of course, all the previous training and funding from the Central Intelligence Agency for the past 10 years, or at least 8, during the Soviet war. I mean, we've given them training, and it wasn't just the CIA. You had the British MI6, the Israeli Mossad, the Pakistan ISI, major funding, major intelligence services, providing training, funding, arms for the last 8 to 10 years within the war, and now the civil war regarding the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. This lasted for the next 8 years, and it was truly what really ripped apart Afghanistan. Meanwhile, let's travel over to the United States. What was happening there? The United States didn't run into a religious problem or a fundamentalist, so to speak. Throughout the 1980s, basically, you had a number of hijackings that were happening in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, where groups like Hezbollah, headed under Imad Mughniya, who were against Western influence, basically the disastrous foreign policy of the United States and Israel, which was basically trying to reshape the Middle East. If we are to entertain previous documents such as the Oded Yinon Plan, which I really don't like to go back to, but I will entertain it because it does give the outline of what we see today as opposed to what we saw 20 years ago, regarding how Israel can manipulate and coexist with certain countries by influencing their leaders through Western influence and funding, and even with threats, coercion through military invasions of these countries. It wouldn't be too hard to call them terrorist organizations or terrorist funding countries and get in line, or you could be next. And so little by little, they can pit these Arab countries against themselves. And this was the whole goal and the agendas of the Clean Break document. Yitzhak, I forgot the author, the translator of the document. It's please butcher me. I'm 51. I'm losing some memory here. So don't hold it against me. I forgot the author of the document. However, but it gave an outline. You can see the outline forming in the early 1980s, late 70s, and then we had the rise of the neocons, which was shaping up to be just an extension of the Zionist policies of Israel. But let's go back to the United States. The United States is going through the stages of the early transformations of having these Islamic fundamentalist influences in the country by the early 1990s. But in the late 80s, we saw some very interesting figures who were coming out of Egypt, for example. One of them was Omar Abdel Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh. He's head of the radical fundamentalist group called the Gamma Islamiyah, which is considered a terrorist group in the United States, Egypt, and some of the Arab Middle East countries, Jordan, Libya. And they are a fundamentalist group. However, they differ in their fundamentalism, say, in comparison to another Egyptian group, such as Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was, in its initial name was Al-Jihad. It became Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was headed by even more fervent fanatics. In fact, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad basically are called Takfiri. Now, Takfiris are Muslims who apostate other Muslims as not being Muslim. This would be the turning point for the Sunni world. In fact, a majority of the Sunni Muslims don't adhere to these abrogated, un-Islamic groups. So don't get this twisted. These are not the generalized Sunni groups that are relatively peaceful. They don't commit to terrorist acts. It's not in the Quran. Basically, they're going by the older texts of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Hanbal, which are basically many generations after the Prophet Muhammad. Nevertheless, that's for another discussion. In the early 1990s, we saw the influences of Omar Abdel Rahman. Now, Omar Abdel Rahman was actually imprisoned in Egypt for being involved, allegedly involved, with the assassination of Anwar Sadat at the time. And he was actually released. He wasn't tortured, not that I know of. He was held at Tora prison along with, I think it was over 600 people that were detained and arrested, and a majority of these people were brutally tortured, including one notable person who would have an effect on the United States forever, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's a co-leader of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and later becomes the ultimate emir of Al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, Omar Abdel Rahman is released from Tora prison. He's actually expelled from Egypt, and he actually goes to the United States. Now, before he comes to the United States, he actually goes to a U.S. embassy in Cairo, Egypt, and he's applying for an application there to enter the United States. This is 1989. Now, he's on a terrorist watch list, a worldwide terrorist watch list. And at this time, the CIA is actually in this embassy that he's applying, this specific embassy located in Cairo, Egypt. And they act as the consular officers. Meanwhile, they're not. They're CIA officers. And they're the ones who actually approve of Omar Abdel Rahman's visa application, not once, not twice, 3 times. That's right, 3 times. His application is approved. And every single time, it was a CIA officer acting as a U.S. Egyptian Cairo consular officer. After this, the explanation by the CIA afterwards was that, oh, we didn't know he was on a terrorist watch list. Really? One of the most infamous radical fundamentalists in Egypt. And you're not in the United States, you're in Cairo, and you don't know that he's on a terrorist watch list, or you don't care to do any background, which is what you're supposed to do when approving of a visa application. Nevertheless, he comes to the United States, and right away he goes to 2 mosques, one in New Jersey called Masjid al-Salam, and one in Brooklyn called Al-Farouq. And the one in Al-Farouq is basically important. And the reason why is because for many years, this mosque was actually partly funded by the CIA, because there was an organization in Pakistan, in Peshawar, during the 10-year Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Arabs under Abdullah Azam and Abdullah Anas built an organization called the Maktab al-Kidmat, and from the English it's called Afghan Services Bureau. This was basically an organization that would welcome neighboring or foreign Arabs who wanted to enter the war and act as the Mujahideen army, which was not just basically comprised of Afghans, but also Arabs, even though Arabs made a small a percentage of this. I mentioned this earlier before. Now, who was going to vet all these Arabs? Who was going to train these Arabs? Who was going to give them money and weapons to fight in the war? Well, the Maktab al-Kidmat acted as the office. Now, who is funding this bureau? It wasn't just Osama bin Laden, who later on approved of the idea, and he built the organization with his money through the tutelage of Abdullah Azam and Abdullah Anas initially. It was the intelligence services, the CIA, the British MI6, the Pakistan ISI, the Israeli Mossad. The majority of the money were coming from Saudi donors who were sympathizing with the Mujahideen, and these are multimillionaires many times over, and the CIA. The trickle-down effect started. Now, I hear this sometimes that from fringe conspiracy theorists, that Osama bin Laden was a CIA asset, he was trained, his name was Tim Osman. No, that's no any evidence of that at all. In fact, his right-hand man, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the co-leader of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and later the second in command of Al-Qaeda, had written a book called The Knights Under the Prophet's Banner, in which he basically talked about this conspiracy theory in his book. And he basically says it's funny because at no point did he ever work with the West. I tend to believe it, that he had no influence with the CIA. Now, not to say that the CIA, did he receive money from the CIA? No, not directly. But there was certain, I think, through trickle-down effect through the Maktab al-Kidmat, that the money came through his way at some point, either from the Maktab al-Kidmat or from the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, New York. Now, the Maktab al-Kidmat, the extension in the United States was the Al-Farouq Mosque, and it was an organization called the Al-Khifa Refugee Center. It was right next, it was actually initially built 1 block away from the Al-Farouq Mosque, and then later became an extension of the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, New York on Atlantic Avenue. And it became one big office. And many donations came through there. CIA, the donors from all the Arabs that were in New York and whatnot. And so basically, millions of dollars went through this place. Meanwhile, the FBI was basically monitoring this place for years. And so Omar Abdul Rahman was basically preaching there. And one person in particular named Mustafa Shalabi, who's an imam at the Masjid al-Salam Mosque in New Jersey and also at the Al-Farouq Mosque in Brooklyn, he was basically a friend to Abdullah Azam and shared many common themes, such as donating money to the issue in Palestine, for example. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when that ended, what they wanted to do was basically concentrate on the Israeli problem in Palestine. And so they want to direct their attention there. And so Abdul Rahman heads the mosque and he takes over the mosque. And it leads to an argument between Shalabi and Rahman. Rahman wanted to take the donations that were coming in, which were still coming in with donations, and use it to conduct terrorist actions against the secular Egyptian government headed by Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Shalabi disagreed. He wanted to use the money to rebuild Afghanistan and get rid of the Taliban, and Abdullah Azam wanted to use the funding from the Maktab al-Kidmat to concentrate on the issue of Palestine in Israel. Ayman al-Zawahiri, he's released, from Egyptian prison. He goes and finds his way to Peshawar, working at the Red Crescent Hospital, and he befriends Osama bin Laden there, seeing that he's a man with money. Now, most of his money was coming from his father's construction company called the Saudi Bin Laden Group, which was basically the largest construction group in all of the Gulf. They were the primary construction company that rebuilt Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in all of Islam. So at this point now, there was no Al-Qaeda. They were in the formation of building a group called Al-Qaeda, and it wasn't just called the base. This is a misconception. There was an Arab training base called Al-Masada, located in the Paktia province in southern Afghanistan. And it was the only base that trained and catered to Arabs. Most of the training bases in Afghanistan trained Afghans. They didn't want to train Arabs. So Osama bin Laden built this base mainly for Arabs. And Al-Masada, from the Arabic, means lion's den. And so this became the base of operations. Many of these people that trained and started here would go on later to become the founding members of Al-Qaeda, the base, meaning not a database, but the base of Al-Masada. And so these people were training in small guerrilla fire, and they weren't a terrorist organization at first. They were a training base. They were going to train Afghans in the arts of small guerrilla warfare. They weren't as hardened battleists or leaders such as the Afghans were. They were notorious fighters, but they lacked in small gunfire, building bombs. This is where the Arabs were experts in, and they were teaching the Afghans this in their base. And so the Osama bin Laden then takes his base of operations from Afghanistan to the Sudan. And while there, he takes Ayman al-Zawahiri with him and the rest of the Egyptian radical fundamentalists, such as Sayyid Imam al-Sharif and Abu Hafs al-Masri, who later becomes known as Muhammad Atef. And he's the military commander, as well as Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, who's the initial military commander of Al-Qaeda, and he's actually the one who actually builds Al-Qaeda into a military battalion in Sudan. But still, up until this point, and we're talking about 1992, 93, Al-Qaeda was not a terrorist organization. Now, after all this, you have the CIA and the FBI in New York monitoring the Al Farouk Mosque. You have the many years prior where the CIA, Pakistan ISI, Israeli Mossad, British MI6, who were pumping millions and millions of dollars and funding and training these Arabs and Afghans in the fight against the Soviets. And now all these intelligence apparatuses basically leave, and all these Mujahideen fighters go back home after the war. And what do? Well, there's no off switch. Many of these people are fundamentalists. So they go back to the Philippines, Indonesia, Northern Africa, and the United States. Now, let's go back to Brooklyn. Omar Abdel Rahman, basically, who is CIA approved because his visa comes from the CIA, even though he's on a watch list. He's inside the United States. The CIA knows this, doesn't tell the State Department or the FBI about his presence, but the FBI found out that he's inside the United States, and they sent a mole into the Al Farouk Mosque. His name is Imad Salem. Now, at this time, Omar Abdel Rahman has a major disagreement with Mustafa Shalabi, spreads nasty rumors about him. At about this same time, in 1988-89, just about a year or two prior to Rahman doing this, Ayman al-Zawahiri is actually spreading rumors about Abdullah Azzam. Now, I'll tell you why this has to be an important connection. The reason is because in 1989, Abdullah Azzam is assassinated. He's killed by a roadside bomb while going to the mosque with his two sons, and everyone's killed. Now, who takes over the Maktab al-Kidmat? Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And with Azzam out of the way, now the concentration is not on Israel. Now the concentration is on the jihad against the West. 2 years later, Omar Abdel Rahman, it's alleged that he's behind the murder of Mustafa Shalabi. Shalabi is killed, and nobody knows who killed him. He's actually found stabbed and beaten to death, and they don't know. But the FBI thinks that Omar Abdul Rahman had a major influence in his murder, because up to the lead up to his murder, he was spreading nasty rumors. Shalabi was going to leave and go to, I believe it was Egypt at the time. I don't quote me on that. I think I'm wrong about that. But he was going to leave the country, and just days before he was going to leave, he was found murdered. So who took over the mosque? Omar Abdul Rahman. What was the focus on? The United States and Israel. Do you see where I'm getting at here? Whereas prior, with the Maktab al-Kidmat, Abdul Azzam wanted to concentrate on helping Arabs in Afghanistan, as well as helping the Palestinian problem in Israel. With Azzam now out of the way, you have two fundamentalists in Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, who now concentrate on taking all the money from the Maktab al-Kidmat, which was still coming in, and focusing now on terrorist operations. So Omar Abdul Rahman basically is in the United States. Osama bin Laden goes to Saudi Arabia. And at this point, Iraq invades Kuwait under the President Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athist regime, which is a secular regime. And so Osama bin Laden Saudi Arabia gets the false intelligence that they were going to invade Saudi Arabia next. And Saudi Arabia doesn't have a standing military. The only backing they have is the United States. Now, I'm not going to get into it. The United States has a long history that goes back to the 1940s. In fact, 1938 is when they started the partnership with the United States regarding the United States using Standard Oil, drilling oil wells inside the country. And they became the regulators of Saudi oil. And so Saudi Arabia uses the United States and funds them to the tune of millions, tens of millions to lobbyists inside the United States. And just like Israel doesn't have money, but they have a strong presence regarding both the Democratic and Republicans, regarding congressional influence, heavy political influence. The Saudis just have money. Anyway, you have this influence regarding Saudi Arabia and the United States. And Osama bin Laden goes before the king, King Fahd, and he goes before the family, the king family, called the Sudari seven brothers of King Saud. And he goes before the kingdom and he pleads that he'll defend the country from the Ba'athist regime using the Mujahideen, who just expelled the Russians. They find this to be preposterous and said, no, we'll refuse the offer. However, they were careful enough to put him under house arrest because they did become afraid that he was going to turn their attention on them and throw out the kingdom and fight against Saudi Arabia using the Mujahideen behind them. However, there's a brokered deal between the head of the General Intelligence Directorate, Turki bin Faisal, who makes a backdoor deal with Osama bin Laden and tells him, if you will release you under house arrest, and because they froze his assets, took away his passport, they gave him a deal. And the deal was that he had to leave the country. And if he left the country, they would give him back his passport and unfreeze his assets. He agreed. So he goes to the Sudan under National Islamic Front leader Hassan al-Turabi, who basically welcomes bin Laden because bin Laden is a multi-millionaire man at times over, and he could use that money to rebuild the infrastructure in the poverty-stricken Sudan. Bin Laden goes to Sudan, and he takes with him the Egyptian Takfiris I talked about earlier, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, and Abu Hafs al-Masri, Abu Ubaid al-Bashiri. And all these Egyptians are basically the ones who manipulate bin Laden. All the while, at the same time, the CIA is in the Sudan monitoring bin Laden and the Egyptians. There's a legendary CIA case officer named Billy Waugh, and his last name is spelled W-A-U-G-H. And he's involved with the capture of a notable terrorist called Carlos the Jackal. And it was him and Kofar Black that were in charge of the operation. Now they were in charge of monitoring Osama bin Laden, who at this time was gaining the attention of certain intelligence apparatuses, specifically the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, Fast forward to New York, 1993, 92, 93. There was an FBI sting involving a Hamas operative named Khalid al-Fawaz. Khalid al-Fawaz was basically buying a satellite phone from a Long Island storefront. And the satellite phone was an Inmarsat satellite phone, you know, those old 1980 satellite phones. They're this big with the long antenna. And it was very expensive. I think it was approximately $7,000 to purchase, basically, the satellite phone. And the FBI was basically asking the NSA to monitor this phone in the hopes of gaining intelligence about Hamas itself. So when the NSA started learning about who was making these phone calls, basically it's they were intercepting numerous phone calls. Now, this satellite phone was not only used by Khalid al-Fawaz. He actually sends the phone to another associate. I cannot think of his name right now. I'm actually cheating. I'm trying to look up the name for you. I can't think of the name. Anyway, that associate actually takes that phone and mails it to who? Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden used this phone in the Sudan. So now he has this phone in the Sudan, and basically now the NSA is listening to the phone calls of Osama bin Laden, which was a miracle at this point. Oh, here we go. Now we have intercepts between Osama bin Laden and who knows who's calling him. So he uses his phone, and one number kept popping up, and it's a house in Yemen. So anyway, they didn't pay no mind to it. Now, what happens here in the Sudan? The Egyptians basically manipulate Osama bin Laden, and they start persuading bin Laden to follow an approach that was built within the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. It was a jihad, and it was a document called the Neglect of Duty. And this was written by a co-leader of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad named Muhammad ibn Salam al-Faraj, who was actually one of the founding members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Now, he was basically jailed in Egypt. He was involved with the assassination of Anwar Sadat, and he was actually sentenced to death. But he wrote this parchment and this document, and it basically was a primary influence with Ayman al-Zawahiri, who basically is with Osama bin Laden in the Sudan. They used this document, which basically outlines two enemies, called the near enemy and the far enemy. The near enemy, which was basically secular Arab governments, and the overthrow of these governments by the Islamists with the help of who? The intelligence community. I could get into that in a minute. And then you have the far enemy, which was the final enemy, the United States and the West and Israel. So they couldn't beat the Israeli or the United States in a military stand down, because these are just mujahideen fighters. What they needed to do was one by one take over these Arab countries like Syria, Libya, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and make them into caliphates. Replace the old secular Arab governments, replace them with Islamist governments that would be constituted by the Quran and the Sunnah. However, this is a perversion, because what they're implementing is Wahhabi Islam. Now, Wahhabi Islam is not Islamic. It's basically a heretic by the name of Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, who basically is the co-founder of modern-day Saudi Arabia, which was initially called the Emirate of Diriyah. And to this day, the tenets of Wahhabi Islam has shaped Saudi Arabia. And it's with this ideology, with the help of the intelligence committee I just outlined earlier, that spread this ideology in the poor regions of the Arab world, because that's where religion prospers. It prospers under the poor, bedridden Arab nations. And so, with the help of Saudi donors who was spending hundreds of millions at this point with the Gulf oil boom of the 70s, this ideology spread everywhere. So this ideology helped shape Egyptian radical fundamentalists and this document, which I'm going to outline, as well as a document written by Saeed Imam al-Sharif. I just made a video about him yesterday. If you want to know more about him, go take a look at that video. I think it's 12 minutes long. And he wrote a document that is still used by jihadists today, which catered to the forcible overthrow of secular Arab governments using jihad as the nature of overthrowing these governments and replacing them with Islamist governments by force. Behind the scenes are the foreign and domestic intelligence agencies. Why? Because it was the intelligence agencies who basically helped to overthrow the socialist Arab governments that were prosperous throughout the mid-20th century, early 20th century. There was no fundamentalist problem in the 1920s and 30s or 40s and 50s. Countries like Syria, countries like Libya, Afghanistan were drawing modernity, Western modernity. There was women votes. There was women and men not wearing the veil, not wearing the niqab or the hijab. There wasn't a religious police. There wasn't this fervent religious fundamentalism. You understand what I'm getting at? So there wasn't this influence of Islamism within the Arab world until this advent of Wahhabi Islam, which permeated by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, as well as with the help of the intelligence communities that helped to influence this ideology with their disastrous foreign policy regarding the United States, Israel, and even the Gulf. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, with Ayman al-Zawahiri now influencing Osama bin Laden, he takes the group that wasn't a terrorist group yet. Now Al-Qaeda was trying to fight not the near enemy, but the far enemy. So they were getting ahead of themselves. Now, this was influenced by Ayman al-Zawahiri and Omar Abdel Rahman, and you can't help but wonder how much influence they had under the tutelage of, say, the CIA, the Pakistan ISI, the Israeli Mossad, using like Arab covert Arab groups like the Mr. Avrim. The Mr. Avrim are a very covert Israeli group that masquerades as Arabs. They're mostly used in Palestine or in Lebanon, where they dress up. These are Israeli people, military soldiers, who go through a 3-month course of rigorous training, very rigorous training in learning the language, in learning how to look like Palestinians or Lebanese people, to infiltrate Hamas and Hezbollah. However, these are groups that also infiltrate Islamic radical fundamentalist groups, say like the Palestinian Jihad Organization or Al-Qaeda, for example. It's not hard to infiltrate Al-Qaeda, and that's coming from people like Ayman Dean, who's a British MI6 officer who basically had, according to his book, in which he states that he infiltrated Al-Qaeda. And he met with the hierarchy, Abu Hafsa al-Masri, who's basically Mohammed Atef, and Ayman al-Zawahiri. So take this what you will. It's not very hard to infiltrate these groups, to try and get information and to try and manipulate these groups to commit a terrorist act for a broader geopolitical goal. You get what I'm understanding? It's not that hard to understand how these intelligence agencies can infiltrate these groups, manipulate these groups, influence these groups to basically push these groups to commit a terrorist action, which would benefit who? Well, not us, the common people, not to the Arabs community, the Muslim community as a whole, who condemn terrorism as a whole, but to who? The intelligence community, because they're acting on orders from government leaders, the specific ones. I'm not going to generalize, specific ones. And who benefits from this? Well, I go back to the early foreign policy documents of the United States, Israel, and the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. They're the ones who are at stake. They're the ones who have a lot on the line. Now, later on, as Osama bin Laden gets expelled from the Sudan, because the United States is pressuring the government of Sudan at this point, because now the CIA is basically saying, hey, this guy is more than a money man. He's now a terrorist financier. So they pressure this. And so bin Laden goes and relocates to Afghanistan in 1996. Mind you, the NSA is listening to his phone calls. He goes to Afghanistan in 1996, and the Taliban welcomes him. Now, there's an old tradition with the Taliban called Pashtunwali tradition. Now, this long predates even the advent of Islam, where the tradition is you cannot refuse a Muslim as a guest in your house. So the Taliban accepts bin Laden, even though the Taliban really don't get along with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, even though the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are terrorist groups, allegedly. These are terrorist groups, really. I won't even use allegedly. They are terrorist groups. But they have differences regarding the theological position. The Taliban won't kill Shia. They just want to make Afghanistan as a religious country. Al-Qaeda wants to commit terrorist actions basically to antagonize the West and basically try to commit to a war. But guess who would basically bear the brunt of this attack? The Taliban. And they knew this. So they gave an ultimatum to bin Laden in saying that you would not commit to terrorist actions inside the country against the West. And bin Laden lied to them and lied to the Taliban leadership, Mullah Omar, and basically said, we won't commit any terrorist acts. Meanwhile, Taliban accepted his offer because here's a guy with a lot of money, tons of money. He builds training camps for the Taliban, who are basically still fighting the Northern Alliance, and so they'll welcome bin Laden's money. Meanwhile, the Saudis are funding the Taliban, and who else is funding the Taliban? The Pakistan ISI, with the help of the CIA, even though the CIA is split on this, because the CIA actually does like the Northern Alliance and Massoud. So not everybody in the CIA is as corrupt. So it's very hard, right? Because you think the CIA, the organization, is evil. I agree with you. However, there are some people in the CIA that really try to do good, and these are the field ground officers, but not the higher ups, management. They're corrupt as heck. That's a whole nother discussion. I won't get into that. However, bin Laden's in Afghanistan. The intelligence community knows about this. They're collecting tons of data. And this is well before 9/11. Well before. Abundance. And from two major intelligence organizations. The NSA, the CIA. The FBI is playing catch up. Meanwhile, they're in the United States. And all these influential madrasas and mosques were being funded by Saudi Arabia, as well as older Arab organizations that were there in the 70s under Abu Nidal and the ANO. I won't make this connection because that's too long of a conversation and I don't want to bore you. Anyway, all this is set up in place. And now the Islamist problem begins, right? Because the influence of bin Laden and the influence of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad now permeates into the United States. What happens in 1993? February 26, 1993. There's a bombing at the World Trade Center. It was conducted by not Al-Qaeda, because at this point there is no Al-Qaeda. They're just beginning in the Sudan. It is headed by, or the bomb was created by Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef comes from a very large Baluchistan family. His uncle is actually Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Ramzi Youssef is an interesting character. And to just give you a short rundown, Ramzi Youssef is actually a college student of electrical engineering at the University of Swansea in Great Britain, where he learns, he's very technical, he's very hands-on. A brilliant mind, by the way. And he goes to Afghanistan and he's learning how to build bombs at this very old training camp called Wal Jihad. It's no longer functioning. But there he builds bombs and he meets somebody there, a very nefarious individual. And I have to bring this up, not to take you off the curb, but it's important to know this. Ramzi Youssef meets an individual by the name of, I'm going to forget his name. Why am I drawing the blank? Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad, who just a year prior to meeting Ramzi Youssef, now listen to this, this is important. Ahmadinejad was in a prison in Israel because he was counterfeiting dollars. He was making counterfeiting dollars in a in this primitive machine in a graveyard, and the Israelis caught him, and he was spending, I think, 3 years in an Israeli prison. So they go visit him, and they say, we'll give you an ultimatum. We'll release you under these harsh conditions if you work for us. And what we want you to do is basically infiltrate Hezbollah. And so he does. Oh, I'm sorry, not Hezbollah, Hamas. He infiltrates Hamas. So Abdul Ajaj, who at this point wasn't religious at all, has to play the part of religious fundamentalists in Hamas and give the Israeli Mossad information that he was collecting. Fast forward to 1990. He goes and meets Ramzi Youssef in Wal Jihad training camp in Afghanistan, and he becomes a bomb maker with Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef enters the United States with Ahmadinejad in 1992 using a very crudely made passport in JFK, New York. Customs agent sees this, and Ramzi Youssef says, I'm an Iraqi and I'm applying for asylum. And he talks about being tortured, so they put him to the side. They were going to actually put him at the Metropolitan Correction Facility, but it was overcrowded. Meanwhile, Ahmadinejad, who goes with him to enter the United States, he uses a passport, but it was so badly made that the picture that he's using comes off, and it's a picture of another individual, so they arrest him. And what did he find in the luggage that he's carrying? Documents about how to build bombs, really incriminating evidence. It's almost like he wanted to get caught to show you that he's a religious fundamentalist. Sounds familiar? Meanwhile, they collect this information. He's in jail. The inspectors at the JFK, they let Ramzi Youssef go free. Walks out. Unbelievably, he walks out. Ahmadinejad goes to MCC prison. He's being detained. So Ramzi Youssef goes to the Al Farouk Mosque because at this point, Omar Abdul Rahman wants to bomb New York City landmarks. Imad Salem, who's the FBI agent working as the informer inside this mosque, which is basically feeding information to the FBI, he says, I can build bombs. I worked in the Egyptian military. He never did. He lied. But he did. He went back and told his handler, Nancy Floyd, who worked in the counterterrorism division of the FBI in New York, and he tells her, I don't know what to do. I can't make a bomb, right, or bombs. So she tells him, well, we'll try to hold off. Meanwhile, the man who's in charge of the operation, Carlos Dunbar, basically pulls Imad Salem because Imad Salem won't wear a wire and he won't testify in court against Omar Abdul Rahman and the Al Farouk members, who at this time were being trained by Ali Muhammad in small arms fire. Why is this important? Because Ali Muhammad is a triple spy. Not only is he working for Omar Abdul Rahman and Osama bin Laden, he's also working for and giving information to the FBI and to the CIA. And for years, he's doing this. For years. Training them in small arms fire, training them how to build bombs, all under the tutelage of 2 intelligence agencies. So now Youssef fills in the blank for Imad Salem. Ahmad Salem basically can't build a bomb. He doesn't want to wear a wire, doesn't want to help the FBI. He gets pulled off the case. Ramzi Youssef goes, he builds the bomb, the urea nitrate bomb, in a warehouse in New Jersey, and that is the bomb used in the World Trade Center bombing. Now, the FBI basically said they were going to replace the blasting cap and powder, fake blasting cap, fake powder for this bomb. Ahmad Salem says, don't do that, you'll blow the operation. So they go back and they put back, blasting powder and the caps. Now that bomb is being used in the World Trade Center bombing. Youssef flees. He goes to Pakistan. The people that are involved with the bombing, helping with the bomb and the construction of the bomb, they get arrested. Now, the FBI basically says, well, the operation's over. There is no terrorist organization. It's all over. There's no large-scale organization. Meanwhile, there was. And the FBI knew this. So did the CIA. And so did the NSA. And how did they know that? Well, it's like I told you. They were still running operations, not just in Pakistan, but also inside the United States, who were listening to the phone calls by the NSA of Osama bin Laden, who's getting satellite phones periodically from contacts inside the United States who are being monitored by the FBI. You understand where I'm going with this? So in other words, the intelligence agencies are basically slightly pushing these people to conduct terrorist operations. Now, they believe in the fervent belief of Wahhabi Islam, so yes, they're going to conduct terrorist operations. Meanwhile, the intelligence agencies, they can stop this. They're listening to the phone calls of these people. They're watching these places where they congregate. They can stop all these operations. Now, the question is, why won't they? Right? That's a great question. And I don't really have an answer for that. But I could show you, and I can make a really good argument that they allow these operations so that the governments of the United States can take full advantage of these terrorist acts and pass these laws and invade these Arab countries and say they're fighting a war on terror. Meanwhile, foreign agencies, foreign governments like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf, and Pakistan, and Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, they take full advantage. Why? Because they have preconceived enemies. The enemies, which are basically the former socialist Shia governments of Libya, of Syria, of Afghanistan, of Iraq. Let's fast forward a couple of years, right before 9/11. And at this time, in 1998, this is a key year, the CIA basically is now building a station because there's one number, and I told you this before, there's one number that comes up on bin Laden's satellite phone. It keeps constantly calling, and bin Laden's constantly calling it. And it's a house in Sana'a, Yemen. This is very important because this is the key to 9/11 that most people don't talk about. And I'm not following the official narrative because I believe in hijackers and I believe the planes were hijacked. Believe me when I tell you this, and I'm not lying, this is for the public record. I'm not speculating. Okay, this is public information that you can learn, in which we could take advantage of and say, wow, there's a much bigger conspiracy involving the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Bigger. And that the CIA and the NSA bugged the house in Yemen. The NSA were listening to these phone calls of not just bin Laden's satellite phone, but also to the house in Yemen. The man who owned that house, his name is Ahmed al-Hada. You can Google him. He's an associate of Osama bin Laden that goes back to Afghanistan, the war with the Soviet Union. And because of this, The CIA, who are running human intelligence, or HUMINT, HUMINT, short for human intelligence, they're monitoring the people coming in and out of the house. The NSA, they're listening to all the phone calls. The CIA also puts a bug in the house, so they're listening to half of the phone calls. They could hear whatever's going on in the house. The biggest intelligence operation ever. This is it. We can listen to everything bin Laden is listening to. This is something the 9/11 Truth Movement has completely overblown. Why? This is a huge conspiracy. They've been listening to his phone for 6 years prior to 9/11. Can you imagine what they're talking about on that phone? Just think about this. 6 years. Every single day, there was a phone call made to and from that house, to and from bin Laden's satellite phone. What do you think they were talking about? Terrorist operations, like the embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, the Millennium Plot, the Bajinka Plot, 9/11. Goodness gracious. It's not too hard to think that, hey, they should know. In fact, I'll even tell you, former senior executive of the NSA, Thomas Drake, he actually says that the NSA had so much metadata about the hijackers years prior to 9/11, they could have stopped 9/11 from ever happening in the first place. Ever happening. The CIA could have told. They could have. I don't want to get myself ahead of it here because I've got a little bit to talk about to try and connect the dots for you, to show you that there's a much more bigger conspiracy involving a lot of players. So the CIA and the NSA are listening to the phone calls that are happening in Yemen and bin Laden's satellite phone. In 1998, after the embassy bombings, bin Laden ditches the satellite phone. He no longer uses it. However, they still have the Yemener who doesn't realize that their house is bugged. In 1996, also, there was an operation being constructed, and this was the playbook for 9/11. And it was called Bajinka Plot. I'll talk about this very briefly. The Bajinka Plot was an operation by Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, in which they were going to put timing bombs, called mini bombs, micro bombs, and they built these bombs in Timex watches using nitroglycerin and a timer. And they were going to put these bombs on 12 airliners, okay, and have them all explode when they were over the Pacific, planes coming out of the United States and Southeast Asia. And they were all going to come, and they were going to explode 1 minute from each other, and they were going to explode over the Pacific. And that's just phase one of the attacks. Phase two was the assassination of Bill Clinton, but it was hard to do. So Pope John Paul II, who was going to visit the Philippines, they said they were going to assassinate him instead. The third phase is the most important. They were going to hijack a plane and crash it into CIA headquarters, because one of the associates of the Bajinka Plot, his name is Abdul Hakim Murad, had been a licensed pilot, and he was going to take over the plane and crash it. Where did he get his pilot's license from? Right here in the good old USA. He trained in Oklahoma, in New York, in Texas, all over the states. And now that I mention this, in 1992, I won't go into this, but I just wanted to mention this. In 1992, one of the 9/11 hijacker pilots, allegedly, one of the hijacker pilots was a student at the University of Arizona. That's Hani Hanjour, who was allegedly the pilot of Flight 77. Interesting. But Abdul Hakim Murad, who was caught and is interrogated by by Philippines National Police, he gave up the plot. And what did he tell the lead investigator, Rodolfo Mendoza? Well, he told him this, that there were sleeper cells inside the United States that were training in flight schools. This is 1996, 5 years before 9/11. Who the hell were training these people? Sure wasn't Al-Qaeda. They just got to Afghanistan. Who was training these people? Was it the older Arab organizations that were already here? Was it the intelligence agencies watching from the side, watching the train? Well, anyway, the Philippines gave the debriefing of Abdul Hakim Murad to who? The FBI. 1996. In the briefing is the wish to hijack planes and crash them into U.S. targets. And that there were sleeper cells inside the United States already. What did the FBI do with it? Nothing. Nothing at all. We're talking about 5 years prior to 9/11. 5 years. Instead of telling the FAA or the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, or the high level people at the principals meeting, which is a meeting of the U.S. Army Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the Vice President. They didn't know anything about this. Why was it just shared everywhere? Holy cow! No, it was ignored. Okay, 1998. The FBI is basically looking for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed at this time because they found out that he was part of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing because he gave money to one of the associates, Mohammed Salameh. And I think it was like $6,000. So the FBI in New York, which is a really smart, great counterterrorism organization, the CTC there, called the I-49 unit, headed under John O'Neill, the legendary John O'Neill. Great guy. A lot of people hated him because he was very aggressive and arrogant, but he was he was very good about counterterrorism. He knew bin Laden. He knew that it was a bigger organization than what the FBI alluded to back in 1993. He didn't believe that. He said it was a bigger organization. Okay. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is on the run. He's in Qatar. What's he doing in Qatar? He knows people there. The Ministry of Interior, he visits. Meeting these heads of state. Meanwhile, this guy's a terrorist. What's he doing meeting with the Interior Minister? But the CIA and the FBI follow him there. And Frank Pellegrino, who is part of the I-49 unit, is the only one in New York who is actually chasing him. This is 1996, ladies and gentlemen, well before 9/11. So they have him surrounded. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, he's in this apartment building, I think, or it's an office. They have him surrounded. The CIA and the FBI have him surrounded. They're going to rendition him back. The rendition project that happened under President Clinton originated under him. And that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was going to be rendered back to the United States to be held charges for funding part of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, as well as being behind the Bajinka plot. Right? So what happens? The CIA and the FBI are basically arguing with each other over who gets the arrest. Meanwhile, the Qatari government tells Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, hey, listen, we'll get you out of here so you won't get caught. Guess what? He leaves. Under the two puzzling heads of the FBI and the CIA, and meanwhile, they're arguing about who gets the recognition. Where does Khalid Sheikh Mohammed go? Israel. Where? Now that's reported in the New York Times. I'm making that up. Myself and I brought that information to DJ Thermal Detonator. Just a phenomenal 9/11, the best I've ever met. Anyway, yeah, that's in the New York Times. New York Times reported this. He travels to Israel. How long? We don't know. We don't know. Abdul Hakim Murad, in his briefing, with the Pachinko plot to the Philippines, federal investigators, he tells them that too. But remember, that information is not shared with the FBI, or the FBI doesn't share it with the State Department or the Justice Department or anybody else for that matter. It's ignored. Anyway, okay. In the year 1999, the NSA hears a very peculiar phone call. And it's basically somebody by the name of Khalid. That's all they know him by, Khalid. He calls the house in Yemen, says that there's going to be a high-level Al-Qaeda meeting in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The NSA, who doesn't do human intelligence, they're basically a signals intelligence organization. They share the information, and they don't share, information with anybody. They share the information to the CIA and the FBI because they're the organizations that do human intelligence. So they can follow these people. The CIA does this. And guess who is on the other side of that phone call that Khalid is speaking to? A man by the name of Khalid al-Mihdhar. And if that sounds familiar, Khalid al-Mihdhar later becomes one of the lead hijackers for Flight 77. What's he doing in Yemen? What's he doing in his house? Well, he marries the daughter of Ahmed al-Hada, and her name is Hoda al-Hada, H-O-D-A, Hoda al-Hada. So that makes him the son-in-law of Ahmed al-Hada, and he's living there from time to time. And so he tells his friend and associate, Nawaf al-Hazmi, who's also mentioned on the phone, about this meeting in Malaysia. The CIA basically informs the Malaysian authorities to set up a camera and to set up shop outside of this condominium where the meeting was going to take place. And it happened on January 5th of 2000, and it was held for 3 days. Who goes to this meeting? Some of the most notorious terrorists worldwide. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ridwan Isamuddin, who goes by the Nam de Gur, Hambali, who's involved with a terrorist organization called the Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia and in the Philippines. Yazid Sufat, who's a Malaysian and Saudi businessman, not affiliated with any terrorist organization, although he's linked with Jemaah Islamiyah, but he's not a terrorist, maybe a financier. Zacharias Moussaoui is alleged to have been here. Nawaf al-Hazmi is here. Fahad al-Quso allegedly is here. So a lot of these major people, major terrorists, Fahad al-Quso is involved with the USS Cole bombing, allegedly. So a lot, and I'm missing a couple of names. So I'm just naming the obvious ones. So they're all here. And the CIA gets the photographs of all the people that were coming in and out of the condominium from Malaysia, the Malaysian authorities. They faxed these photographs to a place called the Bin Laden Issue Station. Now, the Bin Laden Issue Station is the CIA virtual station based in Maryland. It actually is an office in this nondescript mall in Virginia, this old mall. So that, nobody knows where this place is, very nondescript. So he basically is inside this mall, this mall. So it's called, the nickname of the Bin Laden Issue Station is Alex Station. Alex Station, it's named Alex Station after the guy who runs, the deputy chief of the Bin Laden Issue Station is Michael Scheuer. He has a son named Alec. So the code name for this place is Alex Station. They're in charge of listening and gathering intelligence from Al-Qaeda worldwide. So because the CIA has an office in every single city around the world, it's not exaggeration, they do. They're getting tons of data, metadata, cables, it's called cables, where they're getting information from the field officers on the ground about Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and anyone involved with them. So they get the photographs of these people. Do they share with the NSA? Who asked for the photographs? Nope. Did they share with the FBI? Nope. Who did he share with? Nobody. Why? Why do they not share this information? Oh, don't worry. It gets much worse than this. Now, after the Malaysia meeting, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who the CIA are tracking, by the way, they go to Thailand. The CIA holds a national, it's called a National Security Council meeting, a meeting of the top levels of government, from the intelligence community, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Richard Blee takes over Michael Short from the Bin Laden issue station. He's the new deputy chief of Alex Station because he's a company man. Short lived outside the lines of the CIA and didn't really get along with the higher-ups. Blee was a company man. In fact, his father is a legend at the CIA. So Richard Blee, not much is known about him besides what Ray Nowolski and John Duffy uncovered, two great 9/11 researchers in their own right, and wrote in the book, The Watchdogs Didn't Bark, which I advise anybody who's watching this to go read. They uncovered who this guy Richard Blee is. So he takes over. So he holds this principals meeting and tells them what? Guess what? We lost track of Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Here are two guys who basically have connections with the U.S. Embassy bombings in East Africa. They know they're Al-Qaeda, and you lose track of them? You'll get where I'm coming at in a bit. So they go to a hotel room in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. The CIA follows them there. I'm sorry, the CIA, they go to Dubai first, then they go to Thailand. They go to Dubai, and the CIA takes photographs of their passport. Then they go to Thailand. So I'm sorry for the mix-up here. So first they go to Dubai, they stay at a hotel, and then the CIA breaks into their hotel room when they're not there, and they take photographs of the passports of Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and they don't share those with the FBI or anybody else. Then they go to Thailand, and the CIA says, oh, we lost track of them. Where does Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi go from Thailand? The United States. On January 15th of the year 2000, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi are inside the United States with the full knowledge of the CIA. The CIA doesn't tell the FBI this, doesn't tell the State Department this. Nobody knows this. But another organization knows this, and that's the NSA, because the NSA is actually listening to the cell phone of Nawaf al-Hazmi. They never lose track of him. But because the CIA can't run operations inside the United States, not legally anyway, who takes over monitoring Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi inside the United States? The Saudi GID, who I talked about before. People like Omar al-Bayoumi, Osama Basnan, Fahad al-Thumeri, who runs the King Fahd Mosque in Los Angeles, in which Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi take a cab ride to after they get off the airport. They go to his mosque. Now, the Hamburg cell. Who are these guys? The Hamburg cell comprised of who? Muhammad Atta, Ziad Jarrah, and Marwan al-Shehhi. These guys are just young guys. In fact, Ziad Jarrah, I did a whole video on this guy about his family connections with the Israeli Mossad that goes back years. I'll mention this briefly here because it's important. Ziad Jarrah is not religious. He comes from Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley, very well-to-do parents, religious parents. Not religious at all. He's friends with Jews, Muslims, Christians, goes to school with them. Ziad Jarrah goes to Germany with his cousin Salim, and they go to the University of Greifswald, where they learn electrical engineering. I'm sorry, aeronautical engineering. While there, he lives alone, Ziad Jarrah. Incredibly, this guy, who has no religious connection at all, goes and frequents the most fervent mosque in all of Germany, called the Al-Quds Mosque in Hamburg, Germany. Amazing, isn't it? Boy, that doesn't make any sense. How is that even possible? A guy with no type of religious fervent in him, no militancy, goes to the most militant mosque in all of Germany? And who does he meet there? Well, he meets Muhammad Atta, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, Saeed Bahaji, Munir al-Motasek. The Imam of the mosque, Muhammad Fazizi, he's there at night. He preaches this anti-Western vitriol about the United States and Israel. Meanwhile, these guys are listening to him talk about this radical fundamentalism. And meanwhile, there's two other gentlemen who frequent this mosque and frequent these guys. Now, these two guys are Muhammad Haydar Zamar and Marmoon Darkhanzali. And I did a video about Marmoon Darkhanzali and his connections with Arab criminality in Syria, Germany. Now, these guys are Syrians, but they're in Germany. Haydar Zamar is actually an Al-Qaeda recruiter. He knows Abu Hafs al-Masri, who's Mohammed Atef, and he's involved with the Chechen war, where Khalid al-Mihdhar first go in the early 90s. So they're basically manipulating this mindset of the Hamburg cell, trying to get them to become more radical in their beliefs. And they're always with them. And guess who's actually trailing Muhammad Haydar Zamar and Marmoon Darkhanzali? The German BFV. It's a long name, and I don't know German, so I'll just shorten it. It's called the BFV or the LFV. They're the intelligence arm. And another agency, the CIA. The CIA knew Zamar and his connections with Al-Qaeda as being a recruiter and recruited him as an informer, or tried to. Zamar and Darkhanzali at the same time. Now, it's alleged that the CIA was also monitoring the phone calls of Marmoon Darkhanzali. The German BFV claims that the CIA was not just monitoring these two guys, but they were also monitoring Ziad Jarrah, because Ziad Jarrah was meeting with a person by the name of Marcel K. Now, there's not much to know about Marcel K. He's a very obscure figure, but he has connections with Hamas. And Ziad Jarrah is actually in talking with this guy even up till the days before 9/11. Shadowy guy, but somehow he has a connection with Ziad Jarrah. Ziad Jarrah is meeting with all these nefarious individuals in Germany, and so is Muhammad Atta, and so is Marwan al-Shehhi. And these guys are the alleged pilots of 9/11. So you can see what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these people who are being watched very closely by foreign intelligence. And I told you before that these intelligence services basically try and push the envelope so slightly so that you can't tell whether they're involved or not. So that these guys can conduct a terrorist action, which they know previously beforehand, because they're monitoring these people's phone calls and watching them, and then take full advantage afterwards. Because what happens after a terrorist action? Well, the United States gets involved. So does Israel. So does Saudi Arabia. See what I'm talking about? A much bigger conspiracy involving major governments. These guys come to the United States from Hamburg, and guess who's following the Hamburg cell in the East Coast? Because they moved to Florida. Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Shehhi, Ziad Jarrah. Meanwhile, Ziad Jarrah never lives with any of the hijackers, always by himself. Strange, isn't it? They're inside the United States. Who's following them? Well, you have the Saudis out west following Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi and even giving them money. That money was traced back to Bandar bin Sultan's bank account, who actually just happens to be the Saudi ambassador to the United States and close friend to the Bush family. This happens to be a coincidence, I guess. In the East Coast, in Florida, in New Jersey and New York, where these Hamburg cell operatives lived, Israeli moving front companies. Moving front companies such as, I know you know, Urban Moving Systems, Classic International Movers, Max Movers, White Glove Movers. Now, how do I know all this? Because on September 11th, you know this story, Urban Moving Systems get over. The East Rutherford Police Department detains the 5 men who are called the dancing Israelis because there was 3 of them. They weren't dancing, but they were celebrating. But in the notebook was all these numbers to these moving companies, who, by the way, the FBI detained many people in these companies. And that's in the redacted FBI reports, which you can view at your leisure on archive.org or on Scribd. So you have the Saudis out west, the Israelis in the east, and the FBI oblivious to all this. Don't know what's going on. They would like to. It's their jurisdiction. Ask yourself why. And how did the Saudis and Israelis know to monitor these people as soon as they came in the United States? Now, I'm going to interview Robbie Martin on Sunday, and we're going to talk about the anthrax investigation, but we're also going to talk about the Israeli art student ring, as well as the other Israeli spy companies that were living next door to these hijackers in Florida, in New York, in New Jersey. All right. Now, the FBI, some FBI agents who are on loan from New York under John O'Neill to the Alex station, they get the cable. Doug Miller, who is an FBI agent out of New York, reads the cable about Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi having a U.S. visa. They read the cable that the CIA came in about the passport they took a photograph of. Doug Miller immediately writes a draft to try and warn FBI headquarters in Washington so they could send this cable throughout the United States and try and monitor them. But they need approval from the CIA, from the Alex Station employees. Most notably, the deputy director of Alex Station, his name is Tom Wilshire. He's second in command of Alex Station. The draft goes for Tom Wilshire to be approved. However, there's another CIA case officer who works directly under Tom Wilshire. Her name is Michelle Ann Casey, a one-time employee of Michael Scheuer, who basically hires all these women at Alex Station, and they're very, very dedicated to Scheuer. And there's a nickname for them called the Manson family. just sociopathic group, these people, some of them. Anyway, Michelle Ann Casey reads the cable, brings it to Tom Wilshire, and Tom Wilshire says this to her: hold off per Wilshire. And that's what she writes on the draft cable. It doesn't go through. Mark Rossini, who's also part of the New York Counterterrorism Office in New York, reads the cable and says, hey, why isn't this being sent out? These 2 guys are bad guys. They're involved with the East Africa bombings. They may have links to the USS Cole bombing in 2000, which was a naval ship bombed by Al-Qaeda in Yemen. These guys are involved. We need to monitor them. Michelle Ann Casey tells Mark Rossini this, and this is actually a quote from the book that Ray Noweliski wrote, and also Disconnecting the Dots, which was a book written by Kevin Fenton. We know the next operation is in Southeast Asia. We'll let the FBI know when we want them to know. End quote. What? How do they know that the next operation is in Southeast Asia? How do they know that? They're the ones who have a, remember, they're the ones who have a bug inside the Yemen hub. The NSA is listening to all these phone calls for 6 years. They would know, wouldn't they? You would think, right? Anyway, Khalid al-Minar and Rafa Hazmi and the Hamburg cell are inside the United States, and nobody tells them anything. And nobody tells the FBI about Saudi and Israelis monitoring and assisting these people inside the United States. Nobody tells them that. But who tells the Israelis and the Saudis to monitor these people? Well, here's speculation. Would it be from the NSA? Would it be from the CIA? Would it be Israel itself? Because of what I'm going to allude to later about having a mole inside the Hamburg cell? Would make sense. That was Ziad Jarrah. Now, why am I implying this? Because much later after 9/11, it came out that a couple of people in Ziad Jarrah's family worked for Israeli intelligence. What? Well, he had an uncle, Ali al-Jarrah, who worked for the Israeli intelligence for 25 years. And he was a school teacher in Lebanon, and he was informing against Hezbollah. He had a brother named Joseph al-Jarrah who helped him spy for 10 years. Now, there's another cousin named Asim al-Jarrah who's a spy, not just for Israel, but for Libya and Germany for 20 years prior, involving the Abu Nidal organization, many years prior. So here you have a family that has a history of Israeli intelligence as well as foreign intelligence. Wouldn't you think that Al-Qaeda, this large terrorist organization, would vet their members properly when Ziad Jarrah allegedly gave bayat, loyalty to bin Laden in Afghanistan in 2000, in which he did meet bin Laden and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? There's video of this. Who's to say that Ziad Jarrah is not an Israeli mole? Now, I'm not just saying that, oh, I'm doing this because I'm an anti-Semite and I hate Israel. No, that's far from the case. I'm only speculating that Ziad Jarrah is an Israeli spy because where there's smoke, there's fire. Ziad Jarrah never lives with the hijackers at any point, ever. He always lives alone. His family's involved with Israeli intelligence. Al-Qaeda never picks this up. Doesn't do any background searches, although they do, because they have a security wing of Al-Qaeda. They also have a media wing, a Shura Council meeting wing. It's a big organization. It's big. Not as big as what, the intelligence of the FBI suggests. But yeah, they're a big organization. They don't realize that this guy has an uncle in Israeli intelligence. No, we're not going to involve him in the biggest terrorist operation ever constructed by Al-Qaeda. Incredible. All right, but remember what I said. I'm only speculating that he is. And that's being honest. All right. 9/11 happens. The biggest intelligence failure of all time. That's what the intelligence community wants you to believe. And also the Bush White House. Right? All these neocons. It was just an intelligence failure. Wasn't that what the two congressional inquiries were about? 9/11 Commission, the Joint House Inquiry. The Joint House Inquiry just strictly concentrated on the intelligence agencies' involvement pre-9/11 and basically said, oh, it was just an intelligence failure afterwards. That's what the 9/11 Commission final report said. A failure to communicate. Or was it? It came out later through the Inspector General report of the CIA that it was more than just a failure. It was actually malfeasance at the most severe levels. Guess what wasn't talked about in the 9/11 Commission report? the Saudis and Israelis monitoring these people for years prior. Oh, sure, they talked about the CIA to an extent, but did they talk about the NSA monitoring the hub in Yemen for 6 years? Only 2 questions were ever asked to Director Michael Hayden at the 9/11 Commission. It was like 2 or 3 questions. The leading agency who had the most data out of anybody, maybe outside of Israel, who may have had a mole, but that's speculation. But we do know that the NSA has phone calls for 6 years prior to 9/11. With the CIA, it's 3 years prior to 9/11 and probably a little bit longer than that. But their human intelligence goes all the way back to the point of my bio, which I talked about the Afghan War, which is the reason why I started there in the first place, so that you can get an understanding that it wasn't just about no hijackers or no hijacked planes, which basically absolves everybody from 9/11. And I'm not following an official narrative because I believe in hijackers, hijacked planes. That's just a fact, because it's the intelligence apparatuses, like I said before, that know these people are here, that listen to everything they do and watch everything they do and manipulate these people and push them, like I said, ever so slightly to conduct a terrorist act and to allow it to happen. It wasn't Al-Qaeda who made our national defense system be concentrating on these numerous war games. They don't have the power to do that. They don't have the power of a stand-down order from Vice President Dick Cheney at the Presidential Emergency Operations Command in the Pentagon. That's who's running the country. George Bush is in an elementary school far away from anything. Meanwhile, the Secretary of Defense, who you'd think would be important in times of crisis, existential crisis, he's outside the Pentagon trying to help people. He's out of the loop. Meanwhile, he should be on the phone with the Vice President and with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and with NORAD. Because they don't know what's going on, or do they? I don't think they knew about the details, but I think they knew what was coming. You don't need many people involved with the plot. You just need the right people in the right agencies at the right time to give vague information that would allow for this terrorist act to take place, because it's not about the hijacking of planes. It's not about slamming into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. This is trivial. This is nothing. And yeah, that's a bold statement I'm making, because what came after 9/11 was infinitely worse than what took place on 9/11. 3,000 people died on 9/11. Horrible. And a preventable tragedy. And that's coming from the words of people like Thomas Drake and Bill Binney of the NSA and Mark Rossini of the FBI and Doug Miller of the FBI and Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Schaefer, who was running an operation called Able Danger, who was collecting metadata about hijackers in the mid-90s, sleeper cells, in order to destroy the information by the Department of the Army's lawyers, SOCOM lawyers, Southern Operation Command lawyers, who told them, you're collecting information about U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens. These are known people on U.S. visas, temp visas, who are expired from countries. So they're not U.S. citizens. And they know what they're being there. They know why they're being followed. The information is destroyed, not shared with anyone. Sounds familiar? That goes back to 1993. That goes back to 1990. That goes back to Abu Nidal organization of the late 70s, early 80s. That goes back to the Bajinka plot, which I just outlined. That goes back to 9/11. So 9/11 happens. Who takes advantage? I think we all know who took advantage. The United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Because what happens? We blame Iraq for the war, for having connections with Al Qaeda, all based on lies. The rendition program takes off in Afghanistan, in Iraq. The CIA gets authorization from the White House to conduct these illegal renditions and makes them into law about having a torture program run directly from the CIA. But they can't do it inside the United States, so they go to these countries that allow torture, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia, like Bahrain, like Syria, that have long instances of using their Arab intelligence services to torture these people, like they did to Ayman al-Zawahiri in Egypt. And who do they get these people from? Well, they get these people from Afghanistan. And most of these people have no connection to any type of terrorist organization. The first al-Qaeda operative captured is Abu Zubaydah. They torture him for 4 years in Poland, in Germany. Guantanamo Bay prison he goes. And what happens in 2012? The CIA tells him this: we found out you're not number 3 in al-Qaeda, nor an important member. He's being charged with nothing. He's been there since 2002. It's 19 years. Held without charge because the White House made it legal to put him as an enemy combatant, which is not protected under the Geneva Convention, where you have basic rights as a prisoner of war. Well, the White House made it legal through their White House lawyers, like John Yoo, to write up executive orders and rules and regulations about enemy combatants not being protected under the Geneva Convention, and they could be tortured for information, which was all legal, made by the White House and the CIA. The invasion of Iraq happens. False intelligence comes from Israel regarding chemical weapons, about Mohammed Atta meeting Iraqi Ba'athist officials in Prague. That turned out to be false. They tortured a Jordanian militant named Sheikh Ibn al-Libi, who was being tortured by the CIA, who was actually arrested and detained and given to the FBI, in which they were treating him humanely, and you were getting somewhere with them. The CIA director, George Tenet, finds out about this, complains to George Bush, and says, have him released under us. Bush agrees. He goes to the CIA, he's tortured immediately. In fact, he's tortured, I believe, in Egypt or Jordan, one of those countries. And what does he tell his torturers? Anything they wanted to hear. And what does he tell them? That he knew information that al-Qaeda was in Iraq purchasing and making chemical and biological weapons. Days later, that information, along with the Israeli information about Mohammed Atta in Prague, that information is used at the United Nations Security Council press briefing, a briefing by none other than Secretary of State Colin Powell. Can you believe that? Powell doesn't know that the information really is false, but he knew the information is uncorroborated, unsubstantiated, unverified. He knew that much. And he shouldn't have went along with it. But he did. And what happens after that? The invasion of Iraq. Do I need to give you a history lesson on that? You know as well what happened. 1.5 million to 2 million Iraqis are killed. Do you think that's worse than 9/11? I do. We destroyed a country that went under 2 years of civil war. The invasion of Afghanistan was next, the longest war in U.S. history. $2.3 trillion spent on a war, waste spending to the highest degree. Did we beat the Taliban? No, but they came close, and they could have, but they didn't finish the job. I wonder why. They decimated them, and they decimated Al-Qaeda. And in 2002, the CIA created a covert program called Operation Jawbreaker, which was headed under the Special Operations Branch that was created in 2002, called the CIA Special Activities Division, headed by Gary Bernstein, a legendary CIA career officer. And he gave the operation to a man named Gary Bernstein, who basically Operation Jawbreaker was involving the CIA, the U.S. Special Forces, Army Rangers, and the Afghans, Hamid Karzai, Mohammed Dawood, and the Northern Alliance, and the Southern Alliance. There's a Southern Alliance, smaller group. And they made a pincer movement in Afghanistan. So they had Al-Qaeda and the Taliban fighting along with each other, and they decimated them. And they had bin Laden surrounded in this village in a place called the White Mountains. However, Gary Bernstein, even though they had him surrounded like this, and bin Laden's right here, so they had him surrounded. Here's the mountains right behind. So he's basically, his back is toward the wall. Just picture that. However, there's a back channel into Pakistan. Gary Bernstein actually is calling for reinforcements of only 200 U.S. Special Forces to cover the back channel by using helicopters. His request is denied. Who's it denied by? The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Richard Marles, who's getting orders from George Bush and Dick Cheney. What happens? Bin Laden escapes with a ragtag bunch of 100 people, who then goes on to live for another 11 years until he's finally assassinated in 2011. Why is he allowed to escape? Well, that's a question in the CIA we're asking, like Gary Bernstein, who hates George Tenet, the director, and blames Richard Marles for allowing bin Laden to escape. Another instance of failure from the intelligence apparatuses. So, the Israeli moving front companies, the Saudis, who are monitoring the Hamburg cell and Khalid al-Mihdhar, what happened to these people? What happened? It's a good question. Well, guess what? They're all arrested by the FBI in a large sting. So the FBI, the Fox News, incredibly covers the story about the art student ring inside the United States and the Amdocs investigation involving the art student ring using signals intelligence to monitor the DEA, the FBI, and even some officials in the White House. It's alleged that President Clinton and George Bush were claiming that even the White House may have been bugged by Israeli intelligence. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, the investigation was long and hard. It was large. Really a big ring. Big, large ring, Israeli intelligence. The art student ring. And Vanity Fair did a great expose on this. In fact, if you can, Abby Martin and Robbie Martin did a fantastic podcast, which is available on SoundCloud. And I would beg of you to listen to it. Great stuff. Just those two guys are great, Abby Martin and Robbie Martin. Anyway, they're all deported back to Israel, back to Saudi Arabia. You would think, being that they were involved with monitoring and assisting the members of the hijacking plots of 9/11, that the FBI would want to interview them and that they would be interviewed by the 9/11 Commission or the Joint House Inquiry, or at least the 9/11 Commission anyway. Nope. Not one letter to the I in the 9/11 Commission report. There is a report that does detail this. And if you don't know, I'll name the report for you, and you could look it up for yourself. It's called the Gerald Shea Memo. The Gerald Shea Memo is written by a lawyer, he's now retired, out of Chicago, who detailed and paid private investigators to follow the police reports involving the arrests of the Israeli art students and the Israeli moving front companies. Huge operation. He gave it to the 9/11 Commission report, his final report in the memo. He gave it to the 9/11 Commission final report. He gave it to the Joint House Inquiry. He gave it to the co-chairs, Bob Graham, Porter Goss, Thomas Kean, Lee Hamilton. Guess what happened? Zip. Abel Danger. Was it mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report? Zip. The NSA bugging the Yemen hub? Zip. Ziad Jarrah and his family, intelligence with Israel? Zip. Would this not constitute as a major cover-up involving the Bush White House, the Clinton White House, the FBI afterwards, not before, after, the CIA, the NSA, the Israeli Mossad, the Saudi GID? If anyone's here for this whole duration of this video, do you now understand what I was trying to get at from the very beginning to this point right now, and why it took this long to basically make these points? I want you to understand that that's how 9/11 was allowed to happen. It's not about just one day. It's not just about September 11th. The important parts to understand is to what happened before 9/11 and what came after 9/11, because you can understand why 9/11 was allowed to happen. And it comes to our pre-reports regarding foreign policy that was written by the neoconservatives and Israel, the Zionist policies involving decades prior to 9/11, destabilizing these Arab regimes. Because after 9/11, after we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, what else was invaded? Syria, Libya, Pakistan, Yemen, all these countries that once never had an Islamist problem, now they do. The war on terror can happen because you have the intelligence services basically allowing these groups to exist and even manipulating them, pushing them to commit to these groups and acts. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have one country that basically is funding them because their beliefs, Wahhabi beliefs, come from Saudi Arabia. Israel, who basically hates the Arab world as a whole, wants to see all the Arab countries destroyed. But guess who they're friends with? Saudi Arabia. Does that make sense to you? Saudi Arabia is allied with Israel. Does that make sense to you? The United States, who knows that the biggest ally in the region, Israel, is spying on them for years, decades. Is that what allies do? Our foreign policy regarding them has been in a complete disaster. Now, look, I'm not saying Israel, the whole country, is to blame. I'm saying their right-wing government, which is Zionist by its own principles, is to blame. Because there are liberal Jews in the country who are basically protesting the actions of the government. And you do have a liberal press in Israel called Haaretz who, talk about the corruption of this government. Saudi Arabia, what do we have in common with them? Nothing. Nothing. We're so ideologically opposed with this country, yet we have the longer reputation with them, and that comes from the oil market. And yet, this country, still to this day, covers up for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I interviewed a former FBI agent who wrote the Phoenix memo named Ken Williams out of Phoenix, in which in the memo he warns the FBI that there are sleeper cells inside Phoenix who are training at flight schools with known terrorist contacts with Al-Qaeda. The memo is ignored. Sound familiar? He says that when he retired from the FBI, he was helping with the victims' families in their lawsuit against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You know what the FBI told him? Don't help them in the investigation towards Saudi Arabia. What? Our federal agency is telling one of its former agents not to help with the victims' families in suing a foreign country known for terrorism, known for supporting terrorism, funding it, for being involved with the 16 and 9/11 hijackers are from Saudi Arabia? What? What is going on here? I think we all know what's going on here. I think we all know who's to blame here. And I don't want to sound like a broken record that, we have fringe conspiracy theorists over the last 20 years who don't talk about these issues I raised. Now, look, I'm not an expert. I want to make this clear. I'm a regular guy. Look, I'm in my bedroom, for God's sakes. The air conditioner's on. I'm nobody. I'm not smarter than you. I'm not special. I'm not meeting anybody in a garage asking for secret documents. And I don't want you to believe everything I say here today. This is so important. I don't want to deviate from the point I'm making, but don't believe me. I want you to make up your own mind. I want you to take what I have to say today and you research it yourself, because that's when you'll know the truth. Don't believe anybody, not even me. Don't trust anybody. In regards to this information, I'm telling you, it's for the public record. That's why I'm not special. I'm not more special than you. And with these fringe conspiracy theorists, they don't help. And there's so many of them. And I know that some of you probably, and I'm not blaming you, because with 9/11, I've been shocked at how much disinformation's out there. Christopher Bolin, Rebecca Roth, Loose Change, which is the most popular 9/11 film in the world, Alex Jones, CIT, Citizens Investigation Team, Judy Wood. I could go on and on and on. Jim Fetzer. Oh, God's sakes, there's so many. And it's unfortunate. It's so hard to find good people that talk about these deeper geopolitical issues where you could connect the dots. I don't want you to believe something. I want you to know something. That's what I want you to do. I want you to go out and open up your channels. Write stories of your own. I have a lot of followers. To me, 1,000 people is a lot. And I don't even know what to do with that. But I don't want you to follow me. It's great. You see my channel and you watch the videos. I do it for you. But I don't want you to follow me. Because what I want from you is to lead. That's how you build a movement. I want you to learn from my channel so that you become the teachers. And that's what the 9/11 Truth Movement didn't do from the beginning, because they were more worried about numbers. They were more worried about quantity rather than quality. And with that came the opportunists, came the fringe conspiracy theorists. And what did they do? They ruined 9/11 Truth. They ruined it. It's dead. I went to Ground Zero. I live in New York. I went to Ground Zero this year. I saw 15 people there, total, maybe 20. We can't get nowhere with this. If there's no hijackers and no hijacked planes and no phone calls, that means you absolved everybody I mentioned today. Because with the hijack hijackers, you have the intelligence apparatuses. And with the intelligence apparatuses, you have the country's governments who are the real terrorists. And that's not an exaggeration. They're the real terrorists, not Al-Qaeda, not Boko Haram and these groups, that kill, regionally. And yeah, they're terrorists. But the real people who kill millions, the United States, the coalition, the United Nations, Israel, Saudi Arabia, who are a disaster for global hegemony. They don't want that. They want power unto themselves, and they'll eat each other in the future. And they'll use us in the process. I think we're coming up on 2 hours now, and I didn't think it was going to go on this long. I am sorry to bore you, but I really wanted to elucidate my message clearly. I hope I did that. For you who stood here from the first second, I applaud you. I really thank you. And yeah, I meant it. I meant it when I say that, I'm not important than you. You're important. And I need you. I really do. Because I could count on my hand how many I can, that could talk about these issues. Like DJ Thermal Detonator, Brian Dawson, Robbie Martin, Paul Thompson, Kevin Fenton, Ray Nowinski, John Gold. Wow. Is that it? Really? I mean, I can't think of much more than that. Maybe I'm missing names, or maybe I'm tired, but that's the sad fact of this, because I could give you 50 to 60 names who are alleged experts and who basically manipulate you and persuade you to look down dead ends because they're too lazy to do the research or to be a real independent investigator, which I hope you are. And I'll end the stream here. And thank you very much this is my first live stream. I never did this before, so I hope it was worth it. And I really thank you all very much.